Hello, everyone. We gathered here a few weeks after the Iranian elections in June last year to go over what had just happened. A number of journalists and analysts who covered the elections in Iran at the time and from here were present at the session, and I can see some of them are again here today. And most of us were still just rubbing our eyes and trying to look again and find out what exactly happened and figure out what the results and the repercussions of the election and then the protests and the riots and the aftermath would be. Obviously they went violent and bloody, and all over the world they were covered, but many of those who were arrested are also still in prison in Iran, and many of them have been released. Some believe what became known from that day as the Green Movement has completely failed and is done and dusted now, and some believe it is still there, thriving for change and democracy in a very steady but actually very slow fashion. But we're here today, 1 year on from the election, almost 1 year on, to see what the tumultuous and controversial president elections had 1 year on, and what we can actually figure out, maybe a little bit easier after the passing of a whole year. And how far is the country from a genuine democracy, if going towards it at all? And also, with the UK government, a new government, and a coalition of Liberal Democrats and Conservatives for that, what can the policy of the UK government be towards Iran? And what do they have to do in order to deal with a country which is, some would say, isolated and a bit anxious more than last year? Well, we're glad you could join us today, and we have on our panel Mr. Maziar Bahari, the Iranian-Canadian journalist who experienced everything firsthand, seriously, who was imprisoned in Iran after the elections. Ian Black, who is just here, the Guardian's Middle East editor, hello. Anne Harrison from Amnesty International, and Afshin Rattansi of Press TV. Of Rattansi and Ridley show.
No, Press TV.
Yes. Executive director, producer of Rattansi and Ridley. And I'm Pooneh Ghoddoosi of BBC Persian TV. I'll let you catch your breath, Ian. We'll start with Maziar. Can you just very briefly say what happened since exactly this time last year until now? How do you see it?
Well, I think what you mentioned about what people say about the Green Movement is correct. That some people say that it failed, some people say that it is continuing, and I think the second answer is the right one. I think the people, pundits mainly, they got overexcited by the images of Iranian people marching on the same streets that they marched in 1978. A few months before the Iranian Revolution, and they got carried away and they thought that revolution is going to happen in Iran. The Green Movement was never about a revolution, it was about reform. Most people who took part in the demonstrations after the election, they had voted for Mousavi, some of them had voted for Karoubi. So they had voted for people who believed in the constitution of the Islamic Republic. But they had a different interpretation of the Islamic Republic and what the Islamic Republic can be from people who voted for Ahmadinejad and the Revolutionary Guards and Khamenei, the Axis, which took power after the elections. So the Green Movement, I think, is continuing. The Green Movement started with one question: where is my vote? That question basically summarized 100 years of a struggle in Iran for people to gain their rights as citizens. People who marched on the streets in Iran, they did not want to be part of an ummah. They didn't want to be part of an Islamic they didn't want to be subjects of Islamic State run by an Islamic leader. They wanted to live in a republic. They wanted to be a nation with citizens. So that movement still continues. The manifestations of that movement, which were the demonstrations, those manifestations are suppressed by the current regime, the Khamenei Guards, Ahmadinejad regime. And those manifestations cannot, expressed. But the movement still is continuing, and it's going to change the Iranian society. Your next question would be when. I'm not sure when. Just imagine that Khrushchev's reforms in Soviet Union started in 1954.
So you think slow but steady?
The Berlin Wall came down in 1989. So there will be some change. I'm not sure whether it's 2 years, 3 years, a few decades, but it will change the society.
What do you think, Anne? You've been covering the stories of the arrests since before the elections for many years in Amnesty, and you've had a very busy year, I can say.
That's certainly true. I think I was struck by a comment that was made to a colleague of mine by Shahrzad Kariman, who's the mother of Shiva Nazar Ahari, a human rights defender who's been in prison in Iran for some months now. She asked him whether he had any children, and when he said he had 2 young daughters, she said to him, "I hope your children grow up to get married, because my daughter grew up to be thrown into jail." And what struck me about that is, whether or not you think that marriage is something that women ought to aspire to, is just how normal prison has become for Iranians today. There are whole swathes of people, particularly young people. We've seen students who've been at the forefront of demonstrations of demanding reform, who've been thrown into jail. And that's the reality for them. 1 year after the election, you could say that we've moved from protest to prison. That the authorities, a year ago, everything was about demonstrations, it was about demanding rights, it's about freedom of association, assembly, expression. That's all been repressed, and now we just have a vast prison population of people, and a lot of people outside Iran have forgotten about them, and that's what we want to do. Next week we're going to be launching a campaign for prisoners in Iran. We want to remember that the forgotten prisoners, that's something that that Maziar said in his very moving article about his time in prison, that the prisoner's worst nightmare is the thought of being forgotten. And there are huge numbers of people who are not being talked about in Iran. There are some very famous cases, Jafar Panahi recently, who've been on the lips of everybody at Cannes and so on, but there are hundreds of others who are still detained. And for us in Amnesty, that's very resonant, because we were set up after an article that was entitled The Forgotten Prisoners, that was written by Peter Benenson 50 years ago this year. And so we want to really highlight these cases, both prominent people and all the forgotten prisoners. That's been a particularly poignant issue, I think, for a lot of people in Iran, trying to highlight the cases of the forgotten prisoners, and also looking at the system of justice in Iran, which has allowed these things to happen. Of course, it's not new. As you said, we've been working on these issues for many years, but the whole system, from arrest through to incommunicado detention, when people are often tortured to make them confess to things that really are quite nonsensical when you read the so-called confessions. It's all about the authorities trying to portray a vision of how they see events. They're trying to provide a narrative of why these things have happened, and it's very worrying. We're hoping by this campaign to try and achieve the release of prisoners of conscience, the people that we're focusing on, as well as some of these other issues, more generic systemic issues about the administration of justice, and also to try and ensure that these issues are not forgotten, that the international community particularly continues to address Iran, not only on the nuclear issue. It's particularly important that they continue to talk about human rights issues. Iran is sensitive to its international image. You only have to look at what happened at the Human Rights Council elections recently, when eventually it dropped its candidacy. The international community needs to make a noise about what's happening in Iran and what's going on, and we want to be part of that. There are lots of other issues I could talk about if you want.
I'll come back to
Yes, come back to that.
Afshin, I figure you're not a big fan of what they call the green movement. What do you think has been happening with this so-called green movement in the past year? And
well, I should start off by saying I'm not Iranian. I worked there for about a year and a bit.
You were there at the time of the election.
I left just before the elections, actually for London. And so I traveled a bit around the country, but I was a year or so in Tehran. I've got to start by saying that. Firstly, Amnesty International, I think one of the great dangers facing the world today is the depoliticization of human rights. Because the kind of remarks that you make, and I applaud Amnesty International, I'm against any human rights abuses, is that you can fit into a narrative that Washington or Israel, Tel Aviv, determines. The choice of timing for your report on human rights. I remember when Amnesty was doing reports on Iraq and Saddam Hussein, as they have always. But if you depoliticize human rights, you can help in some parts, in some ways, to catalyze wars that create human rights destruction on a far larger scale than you're speaking of there. If I speak about what you were saying, I understand, because you were in prison. I don't recognize the Iran you paint at all. I think the propaganda
station... Working for Press TV, I didn't think you would.
No. Iran is a country of 72 million people. As far as I saw it, and I knew stringers from England that were trying to get journalists in South Tehran to show the pro-Ahmadinejad supporters. I'm no fan of Ahmadinejad. This is basically the green movement in the rich areas of some of the major cities is basically some very well-meaning people who want to see a transformation of Iranian society for the good. But from what I personally got, basically some rich kids in the streets.
You said you left before the elections.
Yes, I'm getting getting this from people that I know.
Okay. From poor people in South
Tehran. If you just let me speak. So I didn't see this as that kind of situation at all.
Where do you think
Seymour
it is going,
Seymour Hersh, I think, is important. And in all these debates about Iran, the $400 million earmarked for destabilizing the Iranian government, and let's not beat around the bush. We know why we're talking about Iran on the international news, about nuclear weapons, about all this. We're talking about it because it is one of the center of mankind's energy resources. We wouldn't be talking about Iran if it wasn't. And what the green movement is, I fear, nothing to do with whatever transformation does occur in Iran.
So
and as for BBC Persian, this was an arm of the British government to try and further destabilize Iran. That's plain and simple. It was like Al-Hurra in Iraq.
The meeting already.
And I mean, I worked at the BBC. I was at the Today program during the Iraq conflict and the Kelly suicide. I know what the BBC is like now. I saw it over the Gaza massacre. So that's
is there any point in continuing the debate about what can happen in Iran?
No, we can discuss. Of course, we can discuss.
So that was my question originally.
You mentioned what is not happening. What is happening?
I'm trying to provide a context in which to understand the issues post-election. As to what's happening in Iran right now,
or before,
I would say that Israel's actions are certainly helping people come together throughout the country. The greatest recruiting sergeant of not only theocratic regimes, but of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and who else. I'd say that the nuclear issue, greater ties between Turkey, Brazil, and Iran. I was at the Non-Aligned Movement conference when I was there, 119 foreign ministers in Tehran. Iran is not isolated at all. It's only if you listen to the BBC or corporate media that you would think that Iran is isolated. It is not isolated at all. There are regular visits from the developing world. Basically, it's the United States that's isolated.
And everything is going well in Iran, and the green movement is a minority,
not at all.
you're saying?
It's a developing nation with, on one side, an occupation in Iraq, an occupation in Afghanistan, battles in Pakistan. It's a surrounded country, and as Gramsci said, when the old is dying and the new is yet to be born, a great deal of morbid symptoms appears, and I think the green movement is one of those morbid symptoms.
All right, so because you answered my comment, I'd like to ask you a question. So based on what you're saying, those millions of people, or maybe you say thousands of people, who came to the streets after the election, they opposed Ahmadinejad's re-election. They were manipulated by BBC Persian, and they were provoked by Zionists.
No. These, I mean, I have to say, the propaganda channels are ways in which.
So why did they come to this?
Of course, there were demonstrations. There were massive demonstrations in North Tehran. But Iran is not North Tehran, and that's
the demonstrations were not in North Tehran.
And as for Mousavi, the person.
Sorry, should we go to Ian Black, who was there around the time of the election, and maybe is a least biased among all of us. I don't think you had anything about him, did you?
I last saw Ian in Aleppo.
Afshin and I are old friends, despite everything. I was in Iran during the election last June. It was a very exciting time. I feel it was a great privilege to be there. It was truly thrilling to watch the sense of anticipation and excitement. These, particularly in the last week or so before the election, night after night, many of you will know Tehran, Valiasa Avenue, this great long street that runs through the capital, was thronged with people, many of them young people, many of them, the majority of them, supporters of Mousavi, of the Green Movement, wearing their headbands and carrying the posters. And there really was an extraordinary sense of something new was about to happen, a sense that a victory was over the regime, over Ahmadinejad in particular, who was loathed and demonized and ridiculed, that something great was going to happen. It felt like that at the time. There were demonstrations, vast demonstrations, before the election all over Tehran. There were also in North Tehran, it's true, but not only. There was a sense, I think, that this went beyond the kind of slightly cliched, it's the middle classes of North Tehran and the poor and the downtrodden support this Ahmadinejad. There was quite a lot of evidence of the erosion of support for Ahmadinejad in small towns and in the countryside, which was interesting, taken the subsequent official election results, which of course produced such a surprisingly overwhelming victory for the incumbent. So there's this tremendous sense of excitement and anticipation. Then there was an awful, really just a few hours on the eve of the election, where it was also, those of you who've been to Tehran will know what a difficult city it is, how hard it is to move around, how hard it is to get anywhere in a car, the endless traffic jams, the really choking, awful difficulty of moving around. And suddenly on election day, because it was an election day and therefore a public holiday, it was very quiet. So it was amazing. You could suddenly move around with extraordinary ease, you know, like on a Sunday in London sort of thing. So the excitement continued, and then towards the evening, the mood changed. Friends of mine started to say, and they were all Mousavi supporters, it's true, it is, I think it's worth pointing out in defense of the media, corporate, mainstream, whatever you want to call it, any media, that you tend to hear more from people who are articulate, people who can speak English or another foreign language if you don't happen to speak Persian. But there was this tremendous sense of excitement, something was going to happen. The mood changed and darkened as these ominous announcements were made that first of all, the very quick claim of victory, I think it was 64%, wasn't it, straight away? I mean, within a ridiculously short time, possibly, you know, a couple of hours.
6 hours before the polls closed.
Closed.
Yeah.
I mean, it was extraordinary. And people really, you know, thought, oh my gosh, what is happening? And the previous day, there'd been another very ominous sign from one of the organs of the Revolutionary Guard Corps, this very powerful part of the Iranian system, warning against a velvet revolution. This was the language that was used. It was very much taken as a sign that the regime was not going to sit back and let this, what looked like this extraordinary popular wave, sweep away the incumbent. So that was what happened then. It's worth saying, I think, speaking as a journalist, I'd been to Iran, I'd been many years ago to Iran, quite a lot, and I'd gone again in the year before the elections. I'd been a couple of times, and it was always thrilling to go. It's not easy to go to Iran as a journalist. For those of you who don't know, for a journalist, you have to have a visa to go to Iran. It's not an easy procedure. They're not issued by any means automatically. But the Iranian government was very happy to allow journalists in quite large numbers to cover the elections of last June. The election was on June the 12th. On June the 14th or the 15th, it was a Monday, it was suddenly announced that journalists whose visas had expired would be required to leave immediately, and there will be no extensions of the visas. I mention this because it's worth remembering that in the run-up to the election, there was a prospect that it would go to a second round. So this is a technical point, but an important one, that in issuing the visas, typically for 10 days in my case, they said that if there was a second round of the election, of course, they would extend the visas. The election was over, the result was declared, the dismay and distress amongst Mousavi supporters, and all journalists who were there with these visas were told that they had to leave at once. Now, a few lucky people, John Simpson from the BBC was very cross because he didn't get to Iran the day before the election, but he was actually very lucky because it meant that he was there to tell the BBC's version of the story for 10 days or so after the election, which was, of course, the most dramatic period of the mass demonstrations. Why do I say this? Because since then, since about probably the third week in June, apart from a handful of resident foreign correspondents for agencies like Reuters and the Associated Press, various Chinese, other ones, very small numbers of resident journalists have been allowed to stay in Iran, in Tehran, and to operate under very, very severe restrictions. They were told, for example, they could not go out on the streets after June the 12th, June the 14th, to cover what was happening. They were there, so they were extremely limited. No other journalists have been allowed, Western journalists, I should say, have been allowed into Iran, apart from a handful who were allowed in about a month ago when the Iranian government held a conference to look at the nuclear issue as its response to the non-proliferation conference.
Where the Venezuela-Turkey deal was signed.
Well, it was before that, actually, but the purpose was to demonstrate the Iranian view on this issue. So that we know not very much, actually, in detail about what is happening in Iran, apart from those persistent, brave people who manage to get information out. It's not easy, it can be hazardous. A last point I make as a journalist, just in terms of knowing what is happening, the sort of Iranians that I would meet regularly and other visiting Western journalists like me would meet, people you might roughly call sort of talking heads, intellectuals, commentators, pundits, thinkers who are interesting to talk to in Iran as in any other country, over the month or two after the demonstrations began, they were all arrested. Virtually everybody I knew in Iran and who fits that sort of description was arrested and imprisoned. Most of them were released later on bail. Some of them were put on trial, these awful show trials that you may have seen on the television, looking, in my view, in expert view, looking as though they had been drugged in some cases. I think of Abtahi, the former Vice President Khatami, who was a big, jolly, fat man when I met him, and when he was in his show trial, he was emaciated and looked drugged and spoke. He gave some confession. So we don't know that much, really, about what goes on in Iran today. In the run-up to the anniversary, I mean, well, maybe we should talk about that in a bit, but those are my initial thoughts.
Well, I was just saying, I could reply to those points. I really think, when I mean, admittedly, and you mentioned that, of course, when foreign correspondents go over to countries, they are limited in some ways. Iran poses specific problems, but the idea that one should be that surprised of a country on a war footing to act in the way it does, and we all know how Britain acted when it was on a war footing during the Second World War. We have to get the perspectives correct, and the problem, I think, is with a lot of Western journalists, they arrive there and they treat it like, well, what's happening in this country, is there a parliamentary democracy and so on. Without doubt, and I would say this, Iran is the most democratic country in the region. Yeah. If you believe Afghanistan, if you believe Pakistan, if you believe Iraq are democratic, well, it's up to you. It's not a great region. I would then say that the appalling treatment, as you just outlined, of those figures and the arrests, when you have a country surrounded in this way, threatened by nuclear attack, why would a country not react in that way?
To its own citizens.
Any normal country.
To its own citizens.
No, President Obama, General Petraeus announced yesterday, was it, that there is going to be a counter.
The question.
Well,
which has just been put to you.
Which is.
Well, listen.
I think
Okay.
General
To its own
Petraeus,
citizens?
Well,
What's the
Afshin, with
question?
all due respect, I think
I said
your
General
premise
Petraeus,
is,
if I just finish my point,
Yeah.
has already issued under the new Obama administration more instability. They are bombing people in the south with alliances with
Are
the
they
NKO.
arresting more American
And
citizens inside
if in the
America?
huge roundups these human rights abuses occurring, at least show that context whilst criticizing the actions of the Ahmadinejad.
I was going to ask Ian
But-
what Afshin is referring
That context
to.
is missing.
The media coverage and the context missing. One, obviously, for example, Press TV or Iranian state media, IRNA news agency. For foreign journalists, it seems like they're covering a closed box without being allowed to have a peek into it. But there is national state media and Press TV covering issues in Iran. What do you think about that?
What do I think about the fact that they cover it, or what do I think about how they cover it?
The second one.
Well, I think that they cover it in an uncritical way that doesn't stand up to the sort of standards that we are used to in the West. That's what I think.
What do you
And
think
I
about?
well, I go one step further. I think they cover it in a very disgraceful way, because I give you my own experience that when my confession, quote unquote confession, was made, and it was made under the threat of espionage charges and execution, I went to a room, to an interrogation room, and they brought 3 different television crew to interview me. The second one was Press TV. I was not asked to sign a press release. They broadcast my confession as it was an interview. And I mean, just on that subject, you were working for Press TV at that time. How do you feel about that?
Just before the election, handily.
Okay.
And I left during the elections.
Yeah, but what do you think about that kind of treatment of
Again,
colleague by another?
Obviously, I think it's highly disturbing. I'm against the treatment of anyone in that kind of way.
But do you think it's justified?
No, but I'm trying to provide a context. This all sounds.
Your
can I just
context
say,
is, no, cannot
I-
say,
if I
because you
just
said
interrupt
that. No,
once.
you said that. No, you said that. Because you're comparing Iran right now with London under the Blitz. I mean, there is no comparison between London during Second World War and the state of Iran right now.
Okay, I'll tell you what I'll compare it. I'll compare it with the run-up to the war against Iraq, which killed 1 million people. This kind of conversation, a great journalist, I admire Ian's work massively, talking about what he saw on the ground. I trust everything Ian is saying. I trust what happened to you in prison. I trust you think that what you're doing is right from how you understand Iran. I know that you're committed to human rights. All of this, and this constant drumbeat is the kind of thing we saw in the run-up to the war against Iraq. And I think most people in this country, most people in the United States, don't want a war like that again. And it's amazing that people don't realize that that is the drumbeat that you're providing.
Coming to the point when he says most people don't want another war like that, and we have a new government in the UK. What do you think the British government can do with what is happening in Iran, and how is the best way to deal with it, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, the relationship between the British government and the Iranians is, of course, difficult. There's a certain history there which makes it perhaps difficult for Britain specifically to raise issues in a way that perhaps other countries can't. But at the same time, human rights are an international matter, and something I wanted to address. Human rights shouldn't be politicised. They are something which should be universal. That's why we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and all the international human rights treaties. And those human rights are just as much an issue for countries in the global south as it is for the West, for the EU, for America. And I thought it was quite instructive. There's an imprisoned trade unionist, Maziar Bahari. He's been in it was before the election, but he's been in for several years. He's got a long prison sentence. There were some trade unionists in Indonesia who wrote a letter and had it published to their government saying, you should do something, talk to the Iranians about Maziar Bahari's case. There was a campaign to address the president of Brazil when he went to Iran recently saying, this guy's in prison, you're a trade unionist, do something. They took Maziar Bahari out of his prison cell and put him in with addicts.
An interview of his.
Yeah, and so human rights are of a concern to everybody. It's not just to the West. And
what do you think about when they say some political leaders in the West, including Obama and the Prime Minister in Britain, tend to forget about the human rights issues just for dealing with the nuclear matter or dealing with the political matter with Iran, and they sometimes sacrifice the human rights issue.
Well, I think there is a risk that that happens, and I think that's something that organisations like ours are trying to address, to tell people, no, you mustn't forget the human rights issues. These are really, really important. They're as important as the nuclear issue. It's people's lives at stake. You have to keep those at the top of the agenda.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Ian, what? Yes.
Also, in terms of human rights, I think by abusing your own citizens' human rights, you're not going to make your country stronger. I mean, my issue with the Iranian government is that through these atrocities, they are undermining their own authority. If Mr. Khamenei listened to the voice of people and treated people as citizens, as people who could express themselves, he would be a stronger leader. A year later, he's a more paranoid, much weaker leader because he has committed those atrocities, or he has allowed people under his command to commit those atrocities. So I accept that Iran is surrounded by 200,000 American troops. They have a reason to be paranoid, but the answer to that paranoia is not beatings, killings, incarcerations, and torture. The answer is to accept your citizens in this political process in order to strengthen your own authority and not weaken your authority.
Absolutely. And if we're speaking about Iran specifically, there are some who say
absolutely
that,
I'm right then.
Well, yes, I completely agree. And there are people who say there are people who say that unlike someone like Mousavi, who murdered so many thousands of people during the Iran-Iraq War, President Ahmadinejad is a person who is helping the poor in areas and making them more middle class, like you and you, if I may say so, and will hasten
that
change.
Without knowing me, you met me 1 hour ago.
What I mean is, you know, the sort of people in
nice
no, I mean,
and will
you say
hasten
things,
change in the regime.
No, but the thing is that you say things and you get away with it. Like Mousavi killed millions of people during Iran.
Millions. I said
Murdered.
thousands.
Murdered millions of people.
During the Iran-Iraq War.
Mousavi murdered
On the
millions.
Western Front. The
How did he do
orders
that?
came from him.
Pardon?
The orders came from him on the
But
Western
yeah, that
Front.
was as a prime minister, you mean?
Yes.
Millions of people.
I didn't say millions, I
But
said
he
thousands.
murdered thousands of people. How did he do
Of
that?
his own population.
Okay.
Check it out. But what I'm trying to say...
When was that? Okay.
During the Iran-Iraq War. And immediately
When
after
Khomeini
that.
was the supreme leader and Khamenei was the president.
Right,
But
exactly.
Mousavi is to be blamed for all those.
No, I'm just saying it's an odd figurehead
Order
for
the
your
attacks,
reformist
obviously.
movement. But as I'm saying, Ahmadinejad, who is changing society, and the middle classes are hurting in Tehran under his policies, he may well make the kinds of class changes in that country, which indeed hasten the kinds of changes
Do
you
you
want to
think
see in Iran.
Ahmadinejad and Khamenei are stronger leaders now since last year, or weaker, as Maziar seems to believe?
I think once you have a siege mentality in any country, and certainly the Obama administration hasn't relaxed that siege, you strengthen any kind of government that seeks to demonize completely the outside world.
You say the
What is the
Obama
answer to
administration
that?
hasn't relaxed the siege, but I mean, as I remember it, after Obama was elected, he made several statements, very carefully crafted statements. One particularly on Nowruz, I remember, the Iranian New Year after his election,
Extending the
hand of freedom, and there was never any response. He's written twice to Khamenei. I mean,
While-
I'm just not quite sure about maintaining the siege when Obama repeatedly sent messages of positive engagement to the Iranian regime, and they were ignored.
It's a little like just recently, Obama made a statement saying he was interested in the nuclear swap deal regarding Lula de Nadia da Silva and Erdogan in Turkey, and then purposely didn't expect it was going to succeed. In the same way, Obama was talking double talk. Seymour Hersh in the New Yorker has outlined, pages of how this is on one side, underneath they're actively in there, involved in covert operations to overthrow the government.
Anyway, we're not talking about Obama, we're talking about the leaders in Iran. Do you
government
think
of
they're stronger or weaker than exactly this time last year?
I think things have changed since the massacre on the Aid Flotilla going to Gaza, because Iran is supporting and is closely allied with Hamas and Hezbollah.
Can you tell me how that relates to the weakness or the strength
I think
of
there'll
the
be big
leaders?
demonstrations in the squares of Iran in support of the Aid Flotilla. Governments can
Again,
use
what does that have to do with
they can
the
use
strength of the-
situations for solidarity for others to galvanize support for their
So
own
the event 3
administrations.
days ago makes the leaders in Iran stronger, you mean?
Within their own country, yes.
Okay. What do you think, Ian?
About...
Are the leaders in Iran
Because it
strong or weak?
can be used.
That's a very valid question. There were just so many things being thrown out there. No, I think that what happened. I think that what happened last summer. I think there was a fateful. First of all, there was the whatever happened, whether it was a coup or the numbers were rigged or however you want to describe it. It certainly didn't meet the expectations of people who thought that a Mousavi victory was coming. But then there was a very fateful moment on the Friday afterwards. The Friday must have been, what, the 18th,
Friday
19th?
Yeah.
The Friday prayers at Tehran University, the supreme leader spoke, and everybody was very, very tense and waiting to what would he say, and he gave his unqualified backing to Ahmadinejad. Now, this is the man who is the, however, I know my theology may be a little bit rusty, but the Wali al-Faqih is something approaching the representative of God in the Islamic Republic. I don't think that's an overstatement. And this figure, with all the weight of the Iranian revolutionary tradition, gave his backing to Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who many people believed had just rigged the election. In terms of the intervention of this figure, supposedly above politics, in the dirty business of elections and support for Ahmadinejad, this, I think, I mean, you'll know far better than I, was a fateful moment. His authority...
I mean, it changed the minds of the people about him.
His perceptions of his authority, his infallibility, perhaps,
And impartiality.
and impartiality have gone, I think, for many, many people. The regime... I mean, I think it's an important issue perhaps to tease out a bit in the course of our discussion. What has happened in the course of the last year? I think there's no doubt. I mean, the regime has been weakened, but it's still absolutely in control. I think there are people who fantasize, think wishfully that it's been so weakened, there are fissures here and fissures there. I don't think that's correct at all.
Or
I think
a revolution is a few days away or something
absolutely
like that.
Absolutely. I think it is correct to say that the regime has got a lid on this. They have crushed dissent with a combination of some brutality, lots of arrests, a lot of intimidation, and it'll be interesting to see what does happen on June the 12th, but I would be surprised if there was anything approaching the sort of mass protests that we have seen before. The peak, I think, was probably at Ashura before, in December. The regime has been weakened, but it's still very much there. There's no doubt about it. And that's the difficulty for everybody. First and foremost for Iranians who are suffering and whose freedoms are being affected, and also for the wider world, which needs to engage with this important country.
Maziar, what do you think? Afshin just referred to Iran as a not isolated at all, but a country that has many friends. Considering the recent nuclear deal with Brazil and Turkey and the recent events with the flotilla, do you think Iran has more and more friends in the world since last year, or less friends?
Well, I think Iran has lost a lot of friends, and through abusing its own people, has shown that it's not a reliable government. And as a result, even countries like Turkey or Brazil, who have temporary alliance with Iran, they have temporary alliance with Iran because of their own strategic gains. They are both emerging powers. They want to somehow rise against the American superpower. I mean, Turkey has its own reasons. Turkey has, of course, doesn't like the fact that the Europeans, based on a very racist ideas, don't want Turkey to be part of Europe, and Turkey wants to show what it can offer the world. And I think if Turkey was a part of European Union at all, the dynamic would change. Brazil has its own agenda, but those are very complicated issues, and Iranians, even though many of the people, many officials in Iran are quite ignorant about what's going on outside of Iran, they're very good in terms of using these cracks in the international community. But they're losing friends every day. Like Russia, for example, they turn their back to Iran. China, they turn back to Iran. I mean, I can see that in non-alliance movement. I mean, there are so many countries that I respect, but if you're losing the backing of Russia and China, but if you have good relations with Ivory Coast or Togo, that is not, making friends. You need friends that you can rely on, friends that can
but it's
raise
frankly
your profile.
absurd to talk about Ivory Coast. We're talking about Venezuela. As for the
Anyways,
as for UN Security Council members, Russia and China.
All right, Venezuela,
anyway.
very good, very good,
I think it's just
very good example. No, but you mentioned Venezuela. If you lose the support of
I think
Russia,
this is the problem
which
with
is
journalism, like because it privileges Western European and American journalism to think that the whole
No,
of
I'm talking
Africa,
about losing
the whole
Russia.
of Latin America, the global South.
No.
I think the UN Security Council members, China and Russia, were always going to go eventually with a watered-down sanction. They're too involved in the US Treasury bill system.
Well, but that's not but that's not
they're
the
dealing
issue.
with Iran.
They're
Russia
dealing
and
with
China
Iran.
still.
Of course, they're dealing with Iran. I mean, the business
They're
is
close
lucrative.
financially,
Close
politically.
But the main point is that Iran, through its undemocratic policies within the country, has shown that it's not a reliable government. And as a result, even countries like Turkey do not trust Iran fully. With Turkey, I can give you two examples. One was the investment of the Turkish companies in Imam Khomeini Airport, which was made by Turkish companies a few years ago with the support of Erdogan, actually because they were close to Erdogan, the owners of that company, and the other one was Turkcell. What happened to those contracts?
2007.
The Revolutionary Guards took over the Imam Khomeini Airport, and they took over the contracts with the that was supposed to be given to Turkcell,
So
based
the
on
deals
security
eventually
issues.
didn't go through
So
with
the
the Turkish
deals
companies.
eventually collapsed. So even though we see that Turkey is supporting Iran at a certain point, it doesn't mean that Turkey has become an Iranian ally.
Mind you, they don't have nuclear facilities or nuclear power to help in that deal directly.
But
anyway.
I want to go back to what Ian said about the 19th of June, which is, I think it was a seminal moment in history of Iran, because on 19th of June 2009, it was a week after the Iranian election. Khamenei, as absolute supreme leader of Iran, that's his title in the Iranian constitution, he had a choice. He could lead
answerable
Iran
to the Assembly of Experts and answerable to lots of other areas.
He could lead Iran towards quasi-democracy, which Iran was before that time, quasi being the operative word, or a run-of-the-mill authoritarian regime, like many regimes, as you said, Americans support in the region, dictatorships. And unfortunately, Khamenei chose the second alternative, and he chose to be the leader of a run-of-the-mill authoritarian regime.
Shall we go back to the conditions of UK's relations with Iran, Ian? What do you think about that? I know the new government is already very busy with fresh expenses stories and the Gaza story. I don't think they have time to really think about Iran, but if they do, what would you recommend to them?
Well, before I say what I would recommend, let's maybe just describe what's happening. I think it's important to say that I don't think there's going to be any difference at all between this government and the previous one. The fundamentals of the situation haven't changed. The preoccupation of the British government and other governments remains the nuclear issue, which, despite the flurry over the Turkish-Brazilian initiative, the agreement with the Iranians, it hasn't got any less complicated. The issue of sanctions is still being pursued at the Security Council. I expect the sanctions will be passed probably in June, maybe a little later, because there is sufficient support for it in the Security Council. I don't think British policy is going to change. I think the interesting question to look at for this government and others is goes to that question. I mean, you talked about this, the whole question of human rights, the internal situation in Iran, if it's a contradistinction to the strategic question.
Prioritizing, you mean?
What do you choose between? And I think you find, if you look closely, again, I mean, the British government, whose responses I've seen most closely, the British have a problem, clearly. The British relationship with Iran, the great Satan, not the little Satan, Britain, talking about demonizing countries.
Actually, after the election, the leader said Britain is now the main
Britain is the great Satan. But if ever a country were demonized one by the other, I think poor old Britain has been demonized by the by the Iranians were for good reason. Of course, if you go back to the 19th century and all the, the imperial jiggery-pokery that went on and spheres of influence and so on. Fair enough. But the British have a problem with Iran because the instinct is always to blame the British. So the British have been quite careful not to give the Iranian regime, which doesn't really need excuses to demonize people, to let them be accused of meddling in Iran's internal affairs. So they've been a little bit cautious on that, I would say. They haven't, I think, done much in the way of criticizing or calling into question the legitimacy of the regime, which they might well have done after the elections. The French were much more outspoken with this regard. But what the British have done, I think, to their credit, is that they've spoken out on human rights abuses and on show trials and on reports, very well substantiated reports of abuses and in prisons and so on and so forth. On the nuclear issue, as far as I can see, they're stuck. I mean, there'll be new sanctions at the UN. I myself don't believe, despite Afshin's warning of, the description of a country in a state of siege and at war, I don't believe anybody's going to attack Iran myself. That's my guess, my assessment. And I think what is going to happen is that there'll be more sanctions which will have some but limited effect. It'll be interesting, I think, to see the sanctions that are supposed to target the interests of the Revolutionary Guard, taken their importance, their dominance in the Iranian economy. But everything is focused on what they may want to do on the nuclear issue and on related ballistic missiles programs. I don't think the Iranian regime is going to be much affected by it. I think it's a sort of feel-good diplomacy because the international community feels it has to do something. It seems to me that at the end of the day, from everything we know, everything we can see from the trajectory of what the Iranians appear to be doing, and of course they don't cooperate fully with the UN, so we don't really know. It's secret. They appear to be working towards at least a nuclear weapons capability, if not in creating an actual weapon. And it seems to me that what is likely to happen is that will take place, that at some point they will announce that they've got it. And then, who knows? What will the Israelis do? Will the Saudis then develop their own weapon? I mean, it is an understandable preoccupation for governments, which you can well accuse of being hypocritical in terms of the way the nuclear weapon system works. We've just seen the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Conference. But I mean, to my mind, it is not good. It will not be good news if a regime like Iran acquires a nuclear weapon. And you can talk about double standards, and Israel, and Afshin is being very, very restrained, and all that will be true.
But my understanding is they don't want nuclear weapons.
But would it be good news if Iran acquired a nuclear weapon? I don't think so. So it's, one watches with interest to see countries, particularly those on the Security Council, scrambling to try and do something about it. That's clearly the dominant thing. I don't see any change, really, in that department.
Thank you. What would your recommendation be to William Hague or the Clegg Cameron?
Sure. Well, I mean, just on Ian's point there. I mean, I think any country with nuclear weapons is a disaster. So, and certainly when I was there, the feeling I got was the nuclear program was something very different, which would take another session to talk about. But certainly they aren't out there to develop a nuclear weapon. And
so they say in the face of a lot of evidence that they're doing exactly that, as you must know.
And the constant talk of them perhaps getting one is part of the bluster and part of this paradigm in which journalism seems to be running here. As for the Conservative government coalition, I'm a bit. I mean, I'm an independent journalist. I'm not partisan, but I've been quite impressed by foreign policy so far from the government for what there is. And as Ian said, they're not behaving as hawkishly at all as Paris. And it'll be interesting what to say. But along with Ian, I think they basically go along with whatever the United States tells them to.
And is that good or bad?
Well, it would be nice to live in an independent country with an independent foreign policy, but, we don't live under a democracy here, do we?
And Iranians do.
Thank you. On that note,
well, it would be interesting, actually. I want to ask Afshin. He says that he had a feeling that the Iranians were not developing nuclear weapons. I was wondering, how can you feel that they were nuclear?
I think because analysts, some of the analysts that some analysts do offer the theory that there is rampant corruption in Iran, just as there is in every developing country, let alone the corruption in this country, as we've heard, over arms and whatever. There's corruption in Iran. And there's no doubt that oil exports and the way oil is exported from Iran as a member of OPEC is a complex procedure, how that oil is exported and how that's financed and how the money is apportioned.
And what does
and
that
there's
have
no
to
doubt
do?
that there's no doubt that the government in Iran fears the prospect of power outages and the need to use domestic oil for domestic electricity consumption. So there are ideas of that the oil could be exported instead for foreign currency reserves. That would be one argument for nuclear power, but I'm not saying I know exactly why they want nuclear power with some of the biggest resources of oil on the planet.
Well, shall I say thank you to everyone on the panel and open the floor for questions for everybody?
Hi there.
Yes.
Thank you very much for a fascinating exchange. My name is Saim Baikor, and I should say at the outset that I'm a journalist and a Baha'i, to declare myself. And my question is regarding, since the inception of the Islamic Republic, there are certain minorities, ethnic and religious, that have had difficulties. And I would like to know if in the current period of instability, remembering especially the 5 Kurds who were executed recently, the 7 Baha'is whose trial and incarceration is ongoing, whose trial
In a
date
few
was
weeks,
June.
I think they will.
Yes, in the 12th of June, in fact.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask if the panel thought that minorities had a special vulnerability given what's going on right now. Thank you.
Shall we start with Anne, the expert?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of concern for the minorities in Iran at the moment. I mean, they've had a hard time, for a long time, but I think what we can see since the election particularly is an attempt by the authorities to use some of the minorities as part of their narrative of what has happened. So particularly after the Ashura demonstrations, there were all these statements that it was all Baha'is and Mujahideen and communists and everybody that they don't like who was involved in it. And the ethnic minorities have been a little bit sort of separate from things since the election, because they didn't really buy into the whole Green movement in the same way. But they've always been regarded with suspicion by the authorities. And I think the execution of the 4 Kurds among the 5 the other week was a very clear message both to Kurds and other minorities, don't get involved, but also a way of saying to everybody, this is what will happen to you if you go out and demonstrate. Political prisoners can face the death penalty. So I think, the situation is definitely getting worse for religious and ethnic minorities in Iran.
What do you think, Afshin?
Yes, absolutely.
You?
Absolutely what?
He's agreeing for once. Why are you getting
I agree. I mean, no, I'm just wondering, because you're defending the Iranian government, and then
I'm
you
not
say
defending the
absolutely,
Iranian government.
I thought with the Baha'i question, obviously, is a long-standing issue. The thing with the Kurds recently was particularly disturbing, because although on the face of it, I don't know, but on the face of it, it sounds as though there might be some substance to the accusations in terms of membership.
They were called separatists and
terrorists. They were
terrorists.
called terrorists.
Yeah.
But there was no due process. That's the point. I mean, the Iranian state has the right to try its own citizens, but not if it ignores the sort of universal standards of justice that we expect. And it's clearly taken as a form of intimidation, as a message to other people.
That is a clear example of how human rights abuses inside the country can weaken the central government, because amidst all these fabricated accusations and false accusations against different groups, they said that these 5 people, they were part of this separatist group, separatist terrorist group, PEJAK. If Iran was a democratic country, if there was an independent judiciary, if Iran government behaved normally, people could have believed them, as they believed in previous instances when they, for example, executed members of the terrorist group MKO or terrorist group Jundullah, which is a separatist Baluchi group. But because of widespread human rights abuses in Iran, people do not believe in the claims of the Iranian government. And the other thing about the minorities in Iran is that this government of Iran is a bullying government. And as other bullies, they usually target minorities first. And religious minorities, especially Baha'is, who do not even have citizenship rights in Iran, they are the most vulnerable, and they can be targeted first. And when you look at the history of the Islamic Republic in the past 31 years, you see that the Baha'is can be the indicators of how bad the situation in Iran is. Whenever there is suppression in Iran, there is more pressure on Baha'is. Whenever there is a bit of an opening, there is a bit of democracy, then they lift the pressure from Baha'is. They give them passports to leave the country at least. So I think that is the situation with the, yeah.
Next question? Yes?
My name is Fazl. I've got a question for, a comment about what Ian just said about these 5 people who were executed. In Iran, there was a lawyer who represented 3 of them called Khalil Bahramian. He, on Press TV, I don't know whether it was Pooneh who talked to him or anyone else, or someone else, he said clearly that this guy was 100%...
Persian TV, BBC, you mean, or
BBC
Press
Persian
TV?
TV.
Yes.
That he was 100% innocent. These were his words. And he's in Iran. He's dealing with the family. He's dealing with the guy who was executed. And 3 weeks down the line...
Persian TV, no.
3 weeks down the line, even though in Islamic ethics that you have to deliver back the body to the families, the bodies have not been delivered back to the families. And that's very, very kind of repugnant, for Afshin as well, to work for a TV channel, Press TV, that represents the Iranian government in this country. One more point that I want to make. On this very day, 27 years ago, 1983, 2nd of June, in Mahabad, 59 young people were executed by the Iranian government. The people who were working in the Kurdish area, one of them was Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Another one, who was the governor of Mahabad, was Hamid Reza Jalalipur, who's a reformist, who's a leading reformist now, but he was the governor. He was 20 years old, and he was the governor of Mahabad. 59 people were executed. 50 of them were under the age of 18.
Can I just answer
this is just basically to help Afshin, because he was trying to make a point that Mursavi was also involved in the killing of people, but because he didn't do his research properly, he couldn't pinpoint it where Mursavi's complicity lies in terms of people being killed from 1980 to 1989.
He was talking about war, not official assassination.
No, he was talking about MKO.
He was the prime minister. As a chain of command, he has responsibility for what happens in his country. And his country was Iran. In the Kurdish region, 59 people in one day got executed. Therefore, if there is ever a democracy in Iran, he will be one of those guys who will go on trial, as well as Mahmoud Ahmadinejad or anyone else who was involved in kind of those abuses of human rights.
I would just defend, my working for Press TV. It was getting more and more difficult to defend myself as a journalist for the BBC on its flagship program, because we mustn't forget that the numbers are exponentially higher in the number of people killed by the United States and the so-called international community, as in Western European countries and America and Britain. And as the BBC became a mouthpiece for propaganda in the way that it did, with notable exceptions, censured exceptions so often, but whether it comes to, and I worked at CNN, it was difficult there because we know what CNN, how it covers Latin America. Al Jazeera Arabic, and its reporting of Qatar. Every outlet has its questions raised over it. Yeah. If it was just numbers, I think the British press would probably be the hardest to work for.
Well,
so
going back to
the only place that you can work for now is Press TV?
I'd say there's a freedom. I mean, the way that we covered the U.S. elections with Noam Chomsky and Gore Vidal and others that come on our program, Seymour Hersh, voices you can't hear in the corporate media. Yeah, it's interesting that you have that freedom on Iranian TV. We know why, because the Iranians want that view, which is critical of a U.S. hegemonic policy. But it's a joy to be a journalist working in a country which everyone has that freedom when it's run by.
Well, going back to his question or comment, and also the question about the British government, I think the problem with Press TV is not really being Press TV not being owned by the Iranian government. many governments own different
State
television,
TV
state television. But the problem is that someone like Pooneh, who works for BBC Persian TV, if she ever goes back to Iran, she can be persecuted and put in jail for espionage. People.
No, heresy.
Heresy or espionage as well.
Don't underestimate it.
Because what they said, a Revolutionary Guards commander a few months ago said that whoever works for Persian channels outside of Iran is a spy. So Pooneh is a spy, and one of my accusations was espionage as well. But Press TV operates freely in this country under the protection of...
Wouldn't say freely.
Well, you're here, you're working for
I wasn't
Press
even allowed
TV.
in the London-Afghanistan conference in London
Oh my
because
God.
of the Press TV.
That equates being accused of espionage.
No, but I would say
I mean, you're talking about, like, that is your example.
The history of journalism in this
number of
country
staff
is littered with cases of intimidation.
Yes,
believe me.
but no journalist in this country is put in jail and tortured to confess in front of Press TV camera because he worked for, you know. Okay. So the fact that Press TV works freely in this country is, I think, is a disgrace. I think the British government, Iranian government always talks about reciprocity. I think the British government should say that we have to carry out laws based on reciprocity as well. If you do not allow our journalists to work freely in Iran, then they should close your offices, the offices of Press TV. It's as simple as that.
Shall we go back to the questions on the floor? Yes?
It's almost a year since our last time here, yeah? And I'm amazed that someone like Afshin comes here and produces the same amount of doubt and kind of ambiguity which existed last year. Because last year, I mean, we as people who are connected to Iran had friends on the street and in prison. We were fighting, and not all of us are liberals, and not all of us are people who are kind of produced by CNN image. Yeah? Especially in the left, we are completely under pressure from crazy left like MRZ or Counterpunch and the like, who are saying that Velvet Revolution, North Tehrani, kind of the upper middle class, using Twitter, getting money from CIA. But a year later, even the normal middle class, average European people have learned so much about Iran that image, cliche image, which was produced by Western media for 30 years, doesn't satisfy them anymore. Just look at BBC or any other kind of major channel presenting Iran. It's not the kind of the normal angry Muslim shouting versus like some westernized people. And I'm amazed that you haven't. I mean, you have stuck to that cliche image which existed before the June. I mean, I'm saying that even the mainstream media, even Murdoch's media has changed and has learned about that country, because I'm very sorry to say that it's not about anti-imperialism or anything else. When the nation of a country or a part of the people of a country speak, people have to respect them, especially if that speaking has cost 107 bodies on the streets, 4,000 to 10,000 people in prisons, lots of them called solitary confinement. Yeah. Now I'm asking you, because actually I was the one who got a letter from Chomsky, from Zizek, from Badiou, and from people in the left, from academic left here. I gathered the signature.
Zizek still on the left?
Okay. You were using kind of his attack on human rights at the beginning. Yeah, that's what you were like using at the beginning. Did you kind of talk about Chomsky's attack or Chomsky's defense of Iranian Green movement in Press TV? Because you use Chomsky whenever he's in your side, whenever it's about criticizing Israel. Listen, I mean, we know about the kind of possibility of using the loopholes and the kind of the double standards and hypocrisies of Israel's move or kind of American Guantanamo Bay. But first of all, that's extremely racist to say because Guantanamo exists, and even that Guantanamo was American for Middle Eastern people, not for their own citizens. Yeah? Because Guantanamo exists, people in Middle East don't deserve to have democratic rights, especially when they are fighting for it. Yeah? If that democratic rights was given to them and bestowed upon them by a foreign nation, it would be very, very different. But when Iranian people are fighting for it, they don't deserve to be in Guantanamo or Kahrizak. That's a very, very different thing. Your leftist argument and anti-imperialist argument is extremely perverse. And I'm very sorry, I don't see you as an independent journalist. I think you are here on a mission, and you are on a mission, especially because you made 7 mistakes, 7 empirical, factual mistakes about my country, which means that one of the questions was, is Iran in better position or not? Of course not. After a year ago, they didn't need to send someone like you who is not Iranian and cannot defend the country, hasn't done his homework properly, yeah? and doesn't understand the situation has qualitatively changed. No, Iran has become extremely weaker country, and that terrifies us, because from one side, yes, America and Israel and lots of other countries may have interest in that, yeah. Of course, no one would dare to attack it, but at the same time, the country which could have been moving toward becoming a regional power has become extremely in a difficult position and more paranoid than it was, and they have to send someone like you to defend it. Yes.
Thank you. Do you have any answers?
First of all, they didn't send me, and I'm not speaking here for the Iranian government. I think it's a sign of how polarized the debate is that at the last minute someone like me comes on, because the sheep-like mentality when it comes to perspectives over Iran is so strong in this country. I have really good friends from the political perspectives that you obviously have, who constantly say the things that you are saying to me. I'm not here to defend President Ahmadinejad. I'm not here to defend the Iranian government. I'm here to offer that perspective, which I hope averts the kind of confrontation. I think we had at the Frontline Club people who talk about peace journalism. What's happening here is a kind of trap when it comes to Western journalism, and I completely agree with you as to you know, homegrown sovereign state opposition and what is going on in that country. The thing is, I don't agree when outside agitators are being sent in. We know from Latin America the situations, and it's difficult at this point to see. I mean, as I keep talking about the Seymour Hersh piece, the General Petraeus comment, we don't know how much is being outside. In fact, I'm sure you'd be one of the first to say, don't help opposition movements in Iran with US dollars, because this will only hurt opposition movements within Iran. So, you know, I'm not sent here from Iran. I'm just trying to offer a different perspective to the one, and as I say, I'm sympathetic with Ian's view, there may not be an imminent war, just to have that different perspective, because the problem with Western media is sheep-like, it goes down one line without that context and says, I don't know what the implications of your statements are. Should we attack Iran? How should we change the situation?
No, I can answer the question. Yeah, I think the Western governments should express opinions about human rights in Iran. I think there should be smart sanctions against Iran. I think there should be laws based on reciprocity. I think when Iranian government
But you talk about human rights reciprocity. I mean,
not human rights reciprocity.
The number of people in jail in the United States.
I'm not talking about human rights. I'm not talking about human rights reciprocity. No.
Children in prisons not 10 miles from here. I'm sure Amnesty has covered Yarl's Wood, where there are children in detention not 10 miles from where we're sitting here.
Anyways, we're talking
How many children are in detention
we're talking about Iran.
In Yarl's Wood.
We're talking about Iran, and I think that there should be smart sanctions. I think the Revolutionary Guards travel and investments outside of Iran should be limited and should be monitored by international community. I think there shouldn't be any sanctions that can hurt Iranian people, especially the sanctions that they're talking about in the American Congress about petroleum, refined petroleum. And I think they should continue with sanctions against Iran's nuclear program. My main worry about the nuclear program is not that the Iranian government, the day after they develop a bomb, they're going to attack Israel. I'm sure that they're smarter than not doing that. But it bolstered the Revolutionary Guards. It gives them the confidence to go after domestic opposition and intensify their human rights
with
abuses.
Nuclear weapons?
No. It gives them confidence in order to carry out more human rights abuses inside the country.
Should we go back to the floor, if you may? Question there?
Hi, my name's Di Richards. I'm a series director of a series on the BBC called Iran and the West, which was the context that you're thinking about. You clearly think it was a propaganda.
Can you hold the microphone closer?
I thought that was a brilliant film.
It was a brilliant film done by the BBC.
Yes.
I said with
notable exceptions. Notable exceptions.
Please. You always come up with little exceptions, don't you? So thousands of people in Iran are put in prison, and you mention a few children who are in this country because they are illegal immigrants and we don't have a proper system to deal with them, which we don't like. but it doesn't, you always distract. You talk, as a journalist, apparently, my journalism requires me to have evidence. You talk about there being only riots, the implication you made was in northern Tehran. Not true. You don't have the evidence for that. You talk about you talked about the views of rural people in southern Tehran, which you said you got from third parties through third parties. Hello?
Not Iranian.
Exactly. Well, you are not citing proper evidence. Each time somebody puts a point to you, you exaggerate it, and then you criticise the exaggerated form that you have just come up with yourself. You point out that Mousavi is far less than perfect. It doesn't mean that the movement, I mean, that Mousavi, you say, murdered thousands in the war when he...
Well documented, I'm sure.
No, those were your words, I think. Murdered thousands or murdered millions? I can't
thousands.
remember.
I was very explicit. Thousands. I think you were
That's very moderate of you. It
was about 9,000.
But that doesn't detract from what many of his supporters are seeking, nor does it detract from how they were treated by the authorities. They are seeking a movement of greater human rights, of greater openness. You dismiss them as rich kids from North Tehran. That's an insult to very many Iranians. Sometimes you make sweeping statements. You're not talking about who you hope will win the World Cup. You're not talking about your opinion of the English football team. The statements you make here are designed by you to have an impact on people. Yeah. And yet, the evidence you adduce to bring to those statements is lamentable. When you talked about nuclear weapons, on which I recently made a film about the dangers of nuclear proliferation in the Middle East, including Israel, of course, and I talked to senior Israelis and so on, and Iranians and others in the Middle East. You say, oh, I can say I don't think they're trying to get nuclear power.
It's not me, I'm basing my ideas. Wait, Iran on the West.
What?
You said Iran on
what?
the West.
There are at least five
that's not
projects.
The same documentary I'm thinking about.
There are at least five. No, it's not.
It's not.
It's a new one, different one.
Partisan.
No, it was
BBC
not.
one.
No, well, Iran and the West, which you just praised,
Iran and the West
had the nuclear program in it. I made a subsequent one, which was actually about Israel and Iran and the Middle East. But when you say your sense and your evidence, and you give reasons for it that are 50 years old, by the way. The Shah used the same excuses about, well, we want to protect our oil money. And I interviewed the Shah's head of his nuclear program, who says that the Shah always wanted to keep the option.
I'm not saying that's why they need them. I'm reporting to you what I know.
Well, there have been 4 projects found by the IAEA which are only referable to nuclear weapons and not referable to nuclear power. Now, I don't know if you know about them, I don't know if you've done any research, I don't know if you simply state opinions, but those aren't explicable by a country that is simply trying to get nuclear power. I agree with Maziar that what they want nuclear weapons for is power in the region. It's not to use them. It's not really because they think Israel's going to attack them. It's for power and influence in the region. And I think it's quite clear from the evidence that that is what they're trying to do. And for you to dismiss it and deny it without really much emphasis.
Even what you talk about the IAEA, I think...
the IAEA has always stood between the West.
Mohammed al-Baradei has been replaced. His phone was bugged. There were mysterious goings on.
In other words,
he himself talks about that. I mean, I'm not sure
So you mean the IAEA was under pressure? It was bugged because it wasn't trusted by the West. And yet that same IAEA, which you say wasn't trusted by the West, came up with these 4 projects. Its inspectors found these projects. So if the IAEA is not trusted by the West, and it's
sounds a bit like Saddam having WMD.
Well, I mean, just as a point of information, now Baradei has left the IAEA. He's been replaced by
he's going to write his memoirs, right.
And a report issued yesterday talks specifically of the unanswered questions of military applications of what was known about Iran's nuclear technology. So there are questions. I mean, there just are.
Right. And also various media outlets are saying actually that document is not the way so many newspapers and news agencies are firing it up, saying there's so much new in this document. But when we get Mohammed al-Baradei's memoirs, we'll really know what happens at the IAEA. The latest thing that Ian was referring to that was released yesterday.
There was a report yesterday.
There was this leaked report.
Yeah.
But I think in defense of Afshin, I think the Iranian government really cannot defend itself. And when I was invited to this panel, I asked Frontline Club to get in touch with the Iranian embassy, Khamenei's office in London, and Press TV to send an Iranian to defend the Iranian government. And Millicent, I believe she did try, and she called different people, and basically they cannot defend their actions, otherwise they would have been here. So Afshin gracefully accepted to come on this panel.
Well, I think it's a shame that they didn't send someone from the embassy. Absolutely.
Yeah. Shall we go back to questions on the floor?
You know, I think I still offer a different perspective without supporting the government.
Sorry, I'm Hasiba Harsahrawi from Amnesty International.
Can you hold the microphone closer to you?
I'm Hasiba Harsahrawi from Amnesty International. You started by saying that we should depoliticize human rights.
We shouldn't.
Depoliticize, or we should. I have therefore a question for you. Press TV covers very much the work Amnesty International does on the USA, on Israel, even on Egypt recently, on demonstrations in Egypt, but there's no coverage of our work on Iran. Would you be able to give us an explanation?
I think it's a pendant pair to how the BBC will cover the Amnesty International report on Iran and won't cover in as much detail. We have important people from Amnesty, I could see uses cover the work of Amnesty International on human rights abuses in Britain or in the United States. We don't get that. It's like a tit-for-tat Cold War style duality, I think.
Can I challenge you to cover the report we'll be publishing next week?
I'm not working at Press TV. If I was working there, you certainly could have, and I'd have to have.
But actually, it's an absurd comparison, as you perfectly well know, for goodness sake.
No, we have a death row correspondent, Mumia Abu Jamal, who's on death row in the United States. I mean, the numbers, the millions of people. The United States imprisons more people than Stalin or Mao as a proportion of its population. That kind of figure you're just not going to get in the Guardian newspaper.
But not generally because of who they support in elections, I think you'd agree.
No, but some people say because of their colour, actually.
But it's not just about, as well, reporting on our reports on Iran, but the fact is, if Iran's got nothing to hide, why has it not allowed Amnesty International to go to the country to do independent research?
Obviously, it feels it has something to hide,
since just after the Islamic Revolution 31 years ago,
it
not
feels
since
it has
April
something to
19
hide.
to 79. So,
No, because I completely agree with all the panel that human rights abuses have occurred. In the aftermath of the election, I said that at the outset.
Should we go back to questions? Here, please. Blue shirt, the gentleman with the blue shirt.
Hi, thank you very much. As an American, I'd like to, obviously apologize for the crimes of my country, but I genuinely would love to be at a different discussion about those because I think they do warrant to be covered. However, that's not what I think most of us are here for. My question is actually, is not a polemic, but a genuine question is, I'd like to ask the panel, 1 year from now, how did they view the Iranian situation? Are we approaching some form of equilibrium? And I'm obviously not going to hold anyone to this. I'm just genuinely interested. Are we approaching a domestic equilibrium? And do we have any prospect of approaching international equilibrium where we're not in a situation where one could imagine a war breaking out even by accident just because of heightened tensions, close proximity in the Gulf? Potentially, attempts by the U.S. or the U.K. to destabilize the situation, which I'm not rendering a judgment about. I've read Seymour Hersh's as well, and I'd like to add he's not in any way some sort of oppressed or marginal character in the U.S. Thank you.
Ian, shall we start with you?
What did you say about Seymour Hersh? He's not what?
Some sort of oppressed or marginal character in the U.S.
It's very old and allowed.
But you're asking about a year from now?
A year from now.
Well, I mentioned briefly earlier on the internal situation. My assessment is that things are fairly gloomy. I think the regime, although damaged by what happened last year, has reasserted its control quite effectively. I mean, I think, from what we can see, I mean, it would be nice to be wrong and to see that, next week there will be a tremendous resurgence of the Green Movement and a challenge to the regime, and hundreds of thousands of brave people coming out on the streets to assert their constitutional rights, which is what they've fundamentally been doing. But there's not much sign of that being about to happen. There was much more build-up before Ashura in December. There was activity both by the opposition, by the Green Movement, and indeed preemptive action by the regime. This time there's a sort of almost eerie silence. Not much seems to be happening. There seems to be a sort of a subdued atmosphere and a sort of reluctant acceptance that the regime has reasserted its control. Will much change over the coming year? I mean, it's hard to see what could upset that equilibrium. I mean, interesting to hear you talk about the smart sanctions. There's an interesting link, if you like, between the internal situation and what looks likely to happen internationally. I think there will be these sanctions. They will target the Revolutionary Guard without hopefully damaging the interests of ordinary Iranians. One lesson learned perhaps from the disaster of Iraq, that you have to focus on the people who are vulnerable and in the regime, and not to reinforce the regime by making life harder for ordinary people. But it doesn't seem to me likely that the effect of those sanctions, however intelligently, smartly applied, will be enough to do serious damage to the regime. Perhaps it will contain it, perhaps it will increase a little pressure for it to maybe comply a little more than it has on the nuclear issue. But I mean, it's not a very exciting thing to say, but I can't see, barring some, the unforeseen development, what is likely to change much over the coming year. But
Maziar, what do you think?
Well, I think there are, in terms of your first question about what's going to happen in next year, in 1 year time, I think there are different factors involved here. But I can say that I don't think much is going to happen next week on the anniversary of the election, because as in previous occasions, the government is going to turn major Iranian cities into army bases, and they bring as many revolutionary guards, paramilitary besiege, and anti-riot police as possible to the cities in order to prevent demonstrations. But the Green Movement will continue. And there are two weak points that this government has. The weakest points of this government, the first one is the economy, and the other one is information. So in terms of economy, I think the government is doing the job of the opposition for them. Their mismanagement of the economy, the corruption that gnawing the government from within, it's going to weaken the Islamic regime, and it's going to make it eventually collapse. But the Western countries and Iranian opposition should be careful that the only thing worse than this horrible Iranian regime is a weak central state in Iran. So that will be the danger. But the way that the corruption is really taking over the country like cancer through revolutionary guards and through this access of, and through Ahmadinejad mafia, basically, because Ahmadinejad has his own mafia which operates somehow separately from the revolutionary guards and people who are under Khamenei's control. And the other weak point of the Iranian government is information. And I think that's when smart sanctions can be played effectively. If the Western countries invest in free flow of information between Iran and the rest of the world, and the rest of the world and Iranians, that again will weaken the Islamic regime as it is. And programs like BBC Persian, Voice of America Persian, different websites, social media, and mobile phones, and hopefully they come up with satellite internet. That will change the the political dynamic in Iran seriously. And in terms of sanctions, yes, I mean, there should be smart sanctions, but the problem with sanctions is that smart sanctions are usually not the sexy sanctions. And the lobbies in the United States, especially, I mean, Israeli lobby, of course, we have to accept that the Israeli lobby is very strong in the US, and they affect many policies in the US in terms of Iran policy. They want fast action. And the Obama administration's main challenge is somehow to have a balance that can satisfy AIPAC and others, and at the same time put in place smart sanctions that can be effective, smart sanctions that goes after the finances of the Revolutionary Guards, after the nuclear program, after the travel
those running the country,
bans, those running the country. But the other problem with the sanctions in Iran is that the government is controlling the oil. The Revolutionary Guards and Khamenei, they're controlling the oil. So whatever sanctions Western countries put in power can become powerless because they have their hand on the oil.
Afshin, what do you think?
First, it's nice to know that journalists admit that they support the Green Movement. You yourself said, Ian, the BBC fellow there. I'm independent of all of these sides, first of all, I'd say. Secondly, I'd say that sanctions will fail. They always fail. They failed against North Korea, Burma,
okay, before you
South
continue, I think if you were imprisoned by the Iranian regime,
and then you're a journalist,
put in jail, and
Absolutely.
be forced to confess in front of Press TV who you're working for, I think you would be somehow biased.
No, I'm an independent producer now, selling programs to a variety of
because you didn't go through that horrible experience. So,
Should we go back to what you foresee for the next year?
I see the role of journalist activists, but I'm just saying, let's not think that this is a debate between people that don't support one side. You all three of you support the Green Movement. I'm trying to figure it all out from my basis of knowledge there, from being in that country for a year and a bit. I'd say sanctions will be completely useless.
Where do you think
sanctions
Iran
have failed in Syria,
year?
and in the next year, I think a lot depends on what Israel does, and basically
sanctions haven't failed in Syria. That's not correct. Sanctions can work. The Syrians complain endlessly about not getting spare parts for their aircraft because they're not authorized.
The government's still in power in Syria.
Iran has had more plane crashes.
We're talking about the government.
Simply not correct.
We were there together. The government's still in power.
It's not correct that sanctions don't work. They can work. It's empirically proven because the countries that have them imposed on them try very hard to have them removed. Surely that.
No, the governments don't fall because of sanctions. Cuba will not fall because of sanctions.
But I don't think anybody's trying to bring about.
If anything, countries get stronger, and governments within those countries get stronger.
I don't think the purpose of the sanctions is to bring about regime change. I think the purpose of the sanctions is to raise the cost of things that governments do that are not acceptable internationally. That is the Iranian case.
I think we have to think about sanctions as temporary measures, as tactical measures to contain the current behavior of the Iranian government. In the long run, it's the economy and the democratic movement in Iran
and I think
that's going to change that.
Is helping the poor on the statistics and answers.
Is making the poor poorer by wrong, inefficient, and corrupt policies.
On this note, we have to have the last say from you very quickly, please, because we're running out of time.
Okay. No, I think I would rather concur that things are looking gloomy, particularly for a human rights point of view. I think we're going to see more arrests across the year, more sentences, more people in prison. I think, and more executions as well. I think perhaps the biggest risk that I see is that the government might start targeting people outside the country. I mean, a lot of people are getting death threats. We know there's a history that the Iranian authorities have done that in the past. It might start again. I also think the economy is a very big challenge for the government, and that might be something where actually it's at a weak point, because if the workers actually come out because they haven't got enough money to live on, that's something outside the current political debate and something that the government's very weak on. And if the government can't control itself domestically, it can't play its role in the region that it really wants to, and it's going to be really challenged there.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Thank you, Anne Harrison from Amnesty, Afshin Rattansi, not from Press TV, independent producer, Maziar Bahari, Iranian-Canadian journalist, and Ian Black of Guardian. Thank you very much, everyone.